Good afternoon. I'm John Benton. I'm the conservation chair for the Florida Native Plant Society, and I welcome you to this session where we will explore some interesting new ways to think about shorelines. Florida has over 8,000 miles of shorelines, and a large part of them have been developed because Florida has been pretty liberal in allowing riparian development on salt and freshwater. So consequently, sea level rise, it presents a lot of problems, and a lot of public money and investment has been aimed at this way. So our two presenters today are going to talk about some different ways to think about protecting the shorelines and protecting the vital habitat that is associated with these areas. Our first presenter is Dr. Vincent Encomio. He is with a Florida Sea Grant agent with UF IFAS in Martin and St. Lucie counties. And he's developed educational programming on coastal habitat restoration, water quality, and such. He is also working with better ways to think about modifying stormwater input to these areas for better water quality, better habitat, lessen algal blooms, and the like. Our other presenter, you probably know very well, Marjorie Shropshire is the editor in the wonderful Palmetto that I cannot bring myself to throw away a copy. They're just so well done and award-winning and always informative. She had a career as a creative director and then established her own firm, Shark River Creative, to provide design services. So she and Dr. Encomio and Jenny Stavold I've authored this new book on exactly this process of where we go, how to think about shoreline protection. Marjorie also has many other books, which I have several on my shelves. The Step-by-Step Guide to a Florida Native Yard by University Press, and several other things. So they have a lot to say. So I will get out of the way and let them start their presentation. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much, John. And thank you to the Florida Native Plant Society for inviting me here. I'm really excited to share the work that I've been doing in the general topic, and especially sharing this with Marjorie. Marjorie's been a great partner in recent years with regards to the projects that John has mentioned, and a very good friend. And so I'm very thankful to be sharing the stage with her. And she's been incredibly helpful to me. And you'll see some of in a number of different things that are related to living shorelines. So, and as John mentioned, living shoreline development or coastal development has been has had an incredible impact in Florida, but also across the country as well. About just showing you this map here, a heat map showing red meaning more hardened shorelines, meaning more hard structures like seawalls and revetments and growings and jetties and things like that. So red is the higher percentages of those shorelines being hardened, and then going down to blue, the lowest. The one thing you may want to take note of is in Florida, especially that little red area you see in Southeast Florida, that is Broward County, so around Fort Lauderdale. And those of you that are there in that area know how much of the coastal landscape is dominated by hard or concrete infrastructure like seawalls. So that's sort of the national outlook on shoreline hardening. As we sort of zoom in a little bit more closer to us, let's see if I can, there we go. we see that regionally in the South Atlantic and the Gulf Coast, almost about 2/3 of our coastline are hardened. And the picture there on the right gives you a representation of what we mean by hardened shorelines. In that case, it's that corrugated metal buttressed by a rock riprap structure. So the majority of our shorelines in the Atlantic and Gulf Coast are hardened. And if at the rates that we are going, it's estimated that about 1/3 of all the U.S. coastline would be armored by 2100, if keeping at the pace of hardening that we are at right now. Closer to me, I'm in Martin County. I'm in Stuart. I'm an extension agent for the Martin County office of UF-IFAS. And we are somewhere in the middle there, but quite a lot of hardened shoreline, nearly 50%, with about 69 miles of seawall. And most of those, and this is an important point that I'll get to later at the end, the vast majority of those waterfront lots that are on the coast are residential. And the reason why that creates a problem with hardening the shoreline is you're basically fixing that point in relative to the water's edge. And so, as John had mentioned earlier, we have new problems now with rising sea levels and coastal flooding, things like king tides, which is a sort of almost a new normal with regards to frequency and severity on a annual basis, not just in South Florida, but other parts of the country as well. And that fixed point doesn't give you that flexibility, or doesn't give that shoreline flexibility to respond to those changes in water levels. Eventually, seawalls will fail too, and that's a very costly repair to do for those property owners that live on the water. And from an ecological perspective, that seawall is an abrupt interruption of that, what would normally be a smooth transition from land to sea. So as depicted by the image in the below, the lower image, where you've got this nice wide buffer of intertidal zone at the shoreline and into the water. So, and a lot of habitat space. So that abrupt transition is also interrupting the ability of habitats to not only migrate back and forth between land and water, but it's cutting out a lot of that intertidal zone where a lot of really interesting creatures inhabit and a lot of important ecological functions occur. And so that's an example of what we call this term called coastal squeeze. And essentially what is happening is that, the presence of fixed, hard, or gray infrastructure means that shorelines and existing habitats are squeezed between the water and that fixed point between the water and that fixed structure. So there's very little room for that shoreline to migrate landward as seas rise, and go, and kind of what shorelines would naturally do is sort of move back and forth as conditions change. And so with those hard structures, they can't do that. And that idea of gray infrastructure is shown here. And all the way to the right, the gray infrastructure is really the status quo. That's the majority of what people look to when they're worried about erosion, when they're worried about protecting their properties on land from storms and things like that. Is that sort of the default way to address that? But there's a growing body of work and new bolstered by growing and continuing research that there are other ways to stabilize a shoreline. And one of those ways is living shorelines, where in a living shoreline, this is kind of shown here, you are integrating natural elements, habitats. They're essentially habitat restoration projects, but you're integrating multiple habitats along a shoreline so that they can work in concert and facilitate some of the functions and interactions between those habitats. And I'll describe that a little as we go on. And also, ultimately, what matters probably more to the property owner that's upland or landward of all that is protecting their properties from erosion. So some of the basic things that are important with living shorelines are reducing that wave energy and erosion to stabilize that shoreline. And we start to get environmental benefits out of that too. You can have improved water quality in a couple of different ways. One, having those natural elements like plants, like things like oyster reefs, to absorb that runoff water and the nutrients that are going to be in that, so that when that water eventually makes its way further offshore, it is a bit cleaner. The fact that you're using nature-based elements or using habitats to stabilize a shoreline means you're getting habitat function out of that that can enhance biodiversity and some important ecological functions. And ultimately, what we hope is that this practice of living shorelines will increase resiliency to storm damage and things like sea level rise. And what we're talking about, particularly in Florida, when we talk about the components of living shoreline, really represent key coastal communities in Florida. And in a lot of Florida, especially in South Florida, that's going to mean oysters, oyster reefs, oyster bars, whatever you want to call them, salt marsh habitats. In North Florida, it could be Spartina grasses or juncus grasses. And then in South Florida, mangroves are a really important feature of coastal shorelines and coastal wetland environments. And you can have both in South Florida. So those are the sort of basic elements of living shorelines. And what we're trying to do with these kinds of restorations is really replicate what you see here in the photo. So going into the individual different habitats that can comprise a living shoreline restoration are oyster reefs. And this is kind of where I came into living shorelines. My background is more in oysters. And first doing oyster restoration to benefit things like provide benefits like cleaner water. They're filter feeders. So they, in the process of feeding or on phytoplankton or small microscopic algae, they can clean the water. And by removing that algae out of the water, they're also transferring nutrients to the bottom. And so they are able to help the ecological process of sequestering and processing nutrients. The structure of an oyster reef, with all that shell and all those little nooks and crannies that an oyster reef forms, you've got lots of habitat space for small creatures like the snail that you see there in that photo, a juvenile fish, bird habitat for food, and then all kinds of small critters will hide in that shell as that oyster reef grows. And particularly important from a living shoreline perspective is, as physical structures, they can help reduce erosion and hopefully build shoreline. And you see that image there is a good example of an oyster reef helping build shoreline. You see that spit of sand extending out toward that oyster reef, or I can think the technical term is a tombolo. So that's a good, whenever we see that, when we install oyster reefs, that's a good sign that oyster reef can help protect that shoreline, but also help it grow as well. And the one thing I forgot to mention with the filtration is that they are really the sort of kings of filtration in our estuaries, kind of like the kidneys of our estuaries. It's been documented that a large oyster, adult-sized oyster, under the most ideal conditions, can filter up to 50 gallons of water per day. In reality, when you take across a whole oyster reef, it might be anywhere from 10 to 20 plus gallons per day, but that's still a lot. And so they really have an important impact on water quality in our estuaries. And such that there's a lot of efforts to restore oyster reefs globally and locally. So I'm going to sort of guide you through the historical changes of oyster reefs in my neck of the woods. This is the St. Lucie River estuary here in Stuart, and parts of Port St. Lucie as well. So let me click on here, and you can see, fast forward about another 20-year period, and you've lost oyster reefs. Those could be changes into water quality. Some of it was shoreline development and even some direct removal, but it's not that well documented. But moving forward another 20 years, or roughly 20 years, close to it, you see even more losses, and those losses reflect about a see if I can. Oops, sorry. Reflect about an 80% historic loss of oyster reefs, and it's kind of interesting. I like to show this image because that 80% is really reflective of the global loss of oysters of about 85%. So that we've lost natural oyster reefs across the world, about 85% loss, and that makes oysters and oyster reef habitats some of the probably the most imperiled marine habitat in the world. So that's the importance of oysters, and particularly as a component of living shorelines. As I mentioned earlier, two main types of plants that we utilize for living shorelines, mainly marsh grass and mangroves. And we get some of the same benefits from whether either one of those. Again, uptake nutrients from storm runoff. Some of that could be from fertilizers, but kind of acting as that buffer between the land and the water with regards to whatever is running off that land. They help stabilize sediments as well. So it will help in this case, and I'll show you the next slide will really show that, reduce erosion, kind of build more structure along that shoreline. And of course, this is all good habitat for a variety of different organisms. And just like probably even more so than oyster reefs, they also play an important role in sequestering carbon, and an important component of that sort of new movement of capturing carbon in that blue carbon, using that blue carbon term. So this slide really, I think, really demonstrates the importance of vegetation in living shorelines. And in fact, we define living shorelines first by installation of native shoreline vegetation. And there may be cases where oyster reefs or some sort of breakwater structure offshore of those plantings may not be needed because it's a low energy environment, energy meaning in the form of waves. And so the way we define living shorelines really starts with the plants. This is a MacDill Air Force Base in Tampa. This is a project that's been goes back quite a ways in 2004, but the image above shows pre-restoration and what that shoreline looked like. Oyster reefs were installed, and there were some marsh grass plantings, likely from here, likely Spartina alterniflora, were installed, and the combination or the facilitation of the oyster reefs protecting that area allowed those grasses to grow to the point of what you see in the image below. And what's important about that is that growth of those grasses really represents the growth of that shoreline. And that shoreline, that widening of that shoreline means that that area, it's not little, it's actually pretty big, is that much more resilient to things like changing water levels or coastal flooding events. It's a really good representation of what we hope to see with living shorelines. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, in South Florida, mangroves are an important component of these restorations. And it really is, again, another important habitat that's imperiled in South Florida. Just going back to the Indian River Lagoon where I am, we've lost 3/4 loss of mangroves to fisheries since the 40s. And so much of the mangroves that exist aren't as well functioning as fisheries habitat as they once were. So, and then losses due to impoundments, to control mosquitoes, coastal development. Those are the main drivers of losses of mangroves in Florida. Other parts of the world, mangroves have been lost due to deforestation for timber, removal and deforestation for shrimp aquaculture has been a culprit that's been identified in other areas of the world. But we recognize that mangroves are extremely important for us, especially with regards to resiliency. And I think the image on the left really sums it up. But we need the science behind that as well. And on the right, there is a study that was published by the Nature Conservancy and scientists at UC Santa Cruz to value the flood risk reduction benefits that mangroves provide in Florida. And another image that I think hits home is right here, where you can see having that increased intertidal space where mangroves can occupy is incredibly important to protect our properties, our assets from things like storms and storm surges and sea level rise. I think of mangroves as kind of that shield. If a seawall is the armor, then we can utilize nature-based infrastructure like mangroves as the shield, and hopefully that in over time will render those hard structures less necessary to help protect us. But that's just a depiction there. The study that I just showed earlier really showed over, this is with respect to Hurricane Irma, that mangroves were incredibly impactful in protecting Southwest Florida. So the image on the left is the degree of coastal flooding that occurred during Irma. The image on the right is a simulation of what that flooding would have been like without mangroves. So you can see that. I think that difference is pretty striking there. And the take-home messages from this study is that mangroves reduced flood damage by 25% to properties that were protected by mangroves, and this is in Collier County, and they averted over $1 billion, $1.5 billion in flood damage during Hurricane Irma. So that's what would have happened had those mangroves, if those mangroves were not there. So incredibly important for our resiliency in Florida, especially South Florida. Another aspect of mangroves that is important is that they can adapt to climate change. So this is a study done by a colleague of mine, Dr. Glenn Coldren, where he looked at what's the impact of warming on mangrove and marsh habitats. And that red box on the right there that encloses that image of marsh grass and a mangrove are warming chambers. So he artificially warmed areas of his study site, I think up in around Cape Canaveral, where he could find marsh grass and mangroves together. And the main take-home messages here with this study is that not only was there increased above ground growth in terms of the percent cover of mangroves here, as they were warmed, the reddish bars are warm chambers. And then the other important piece to this is that the below ground biomass, meaning the root structures that below ground, also increased as well. And what that ended up doing, if you follow my cursor to the right there, is that increased the elevation of those areas. So can these habitats not only adapt to warm environments, but can they also keep pace with sea level rise? There's been studies with oyster reefs where oyster reefs in North Carolina have been able to keep pace with the rates of sea level rise, at least in those areas they did the study. So again, I hope that shows how important they are with regards to protecting us. Really is what we're most interested in. And the interesting thing too, with in our area in South Florida where we have salt marsh, some small salt marsh habitats, not a lot, but mostly mangroves, we can utilize the ability of those two species, different species, to facilitate each other and positively interact with each other. Dr. Coldren, who's actually in that photo on the lower right, has a lot of his dissertation work was on the interactions between marsh habitats and mangrove habitats and how they can facilitate each other. And a lot of our techniques for encouraging successful mangrove establishment often starts with planting marsh grass, because those grasses, if they're successful, can help trap mangrove propagules and facilitate their growth and establishment. So we've done things like plant them together. And just to show you a few examples of what a living shoreline may look like. This is a small living shoreline in my area in Jensen Beach, which is just a few minutes north of Stuart. And what you're seeing here is Spartina marsh cordgrass, Spartina alterniflora planted, growing quite well and protected by both adjacent oyster reefs that are adjacent to the growing edge of that grass bed, marsh grass bed, and some small oyster reefs that are offshore of that. And in fact, if you look here, a lot of these oyster marsh grasses, they were planted further back here, so they're actually growing out. Again, if you recall that image I showed you earlier, as those grasses move out towards the water, that's an indicator that that shoreline is growing. And so now the marsh grasses you can see in the lower right-hand corner are even growing past some of the initial oyster reefs that we installed there. Okay, this is a recent trip that I took with the Martin County Florida Native Plant Society chapter. So thanks everybody. If you're here today and you were at that trip, thanks for coming along. This is a living shoreline, more recent living shoreline, and an example, and I'll get to it later, but this is an example of what we might call a hybrid living shoreline, and I'll describe that a little bit later in a few minutes. But just giving you an idea of the type of varieties of native plants that we could find at this location, whether it's not just marsh grass and mangroves. You'll see things like coastal sea rocket and bay cedar. And then the image on the right, you can really get a sense of the different kinds of plants that are found along this restored area. And this was a really an area that was experiencing a lot of erosion, boat wakes, storms. It's a very popular area for boaters where they pull in their boats. People play on the dunes there, and there's been erosion as a result of those activities. So it was, and they have very important assets there. The Lighthouse itself, for example, Native American artifacts, historical artifacts from when it was a military base there. So they had a lot of reasons to protect this shoreline, and the erosion was drastic enough that they had to take much larger, more severe interventions like the rock jetty that you see here. But they planted a lot of mangroves behind it. The other thing I forgot to mention is many of these projects that I've been involved in, these are community projects. So these are all of those mangroves that were planted behind those rock structures were planted by volunteers. So here's some examples of some other plants that we might utilize in a living shoreline beyond just Spartina alterniflora and mangroves. And some of these are further above the mean high water mark, so they're more upland. But it's just a good example of the variety of plants that we can use in a living shoreline. And you do see representations of some of those species being in that transition zone, that intertidal transition zone, from land upland, right there, down onto the beach, where they are around that mean high water mark or even below that. So things like sea purslane, for example, is you see that's the plant that you see on the beach there. But this is a nice, again, this is a homeowner restoration, and I'll get into that a little bit later as well. Okay, so getting into this idea of gray versus green infrastructure, all the way to the left is a pure living shoreline or completely nature-based living shoreline where it might only be vegetation if the wave energy of that particular site dictates it. You may add structure to that in the form of either edging or actual all the way to oyster reef breakwaters, where you're kind of getting into that sort of gray infrastructure realm. A lot of my job involves providing guidance to the community on the potential for green solution to shoreline stabilization, such as living shorelines. But we're not recommending people that completely dismantle their seawalls. So they probably form an important function due to the wave energy of those environments. So how do we reconcile our sort of built environments with nature? A recent article sort of points to, maybe we can have both. And this really gets into this idea of hybrid living shorelines, where a combination of gray and green infrastructure. And I'll show you a couple examples of that. On the right is sort of the future of potential envisioned future downtown Miami, where you've got the existing waterfront there, but also in front of that are things like mangroves and things that can be more protective, be that shield for that armor, so to speak. And that's not just the future. On the images on the left are actually the current, the present, and the not too distant past. Those are, if you look in that upper left-hand image, those are red mangroves encircled by a riprap structure, really what they've called mangrove planters. So they build these outcrops from the existing seawall and fill them in, and then plant native plants, appropriate native plants like red mangroves in there. So these are examples of hybrid structures where hopefully we can reconcile our built and natural environments. And it's a difficult thing to do because there are a lot of barriers into choosing a living shoreline, perceptions of what can work. Contractors play an important role in influencing homeowners and their neighbors also play an important role in influencing them as well. So we recognize that there's an extreme need for education on these kinds of options for waterfront homeowners, and this need to sort of educate everybody involved so that everybody's on the same page when it comes to living shorelines. So we do things like where I'm at UF IFAS, the Master Naturalist program, for example, has a great special topics course in coastal shoreline restoration. So we teach them about oyster, mangrove, and marsh habitats and how those can be combined in living shorelines. So we focus on the general public for that, but we're also now training contractors. So we've developed, Sea Grant has been part of a multi-partner team that you can see with all the logos there on the left, training contractors in living shoreline techniques. So hopefully we can generate an industry that is on the same page with homeowners that want to go this route and look at nature-based solutions to shoreline stabilization. So just a quick plug: we're teaching this class throughout Florida in 2023 and 2024. Our next class is in Flagler County on May 23rd and 24th. You can find it on that website, floridalivingshorelines.com, and we're going to post all of our upcoming offerings on that website. And what we hope to see is that you have homeowners and professionals working together, designing, co-designing living shorelines together, and then eventually building those. And this is a great example of this. This is in Sewell's Point in Stuart, of a landscape architect working with a homeowner and the contractor. That you see all three there in the left-hand photo, where they are working together and collaborating together to create a living shoreline. So I showed you earlier images of that shoreline before. This is the photo image on the right. Is just kind of the early stages, but they eventually planted that. And then we also built oyster reefs offshore of that to protect those plantings. So with that, I'd like to acknowledge all my partners in these efforts to not only restore habitats, but also educate people on restoring habitats and hopefully increasing living shoreline practice throughout Florida. These are a number of my local and statewide partners throughout Florida in the work that I showed you. And with that, I'm like to complete my talk, and I also have a short evaluation too, if you wouldn't mind. You can scan that, and that'll take you to the survey. Should be take you probably no more than five, maybe just a little over 5 minutes. So, all right.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, really interesting. A lot that was covered. So really appreciate that. We have a lot of questions.
Oh boy.
But we also have very limited time. So we've only got a couple of minutes. So I think I'm going to look towards Valerie and see if I have time to ask one or two quick questions. We do? Okay, great. So first question.
Or even things like small boulders, you know, that structure. And the whole idea behind that is like you build the structure, and in most cases, there's enough of a natural population to naturally seed those structures, you know. So
right.
Field of Dreams approach: if you build it, they will come.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
If she means seeding, like direct seeding of those reefs, those efforts have been done as well. But my experience has been somewhat mixed, you know. So you're introducing oyster larvae or oyster seed from a hatchery, and it can be significant, but it's still, if you really, site selection is so key. You know, you want to put those structures in the right location, even placing them at the right time of year to take advantage of what's out in nature. Yeah,
and give it the best chance of success.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, I think we are past our time. So, I want to thank you all for joining us. There are lots more questions, another 20 to answer. So Vincent and Marjorie, if you wouldn't mind hopping on to Hoover, if you've got that access to that, and answer some more questions, we'd be super grateful. There's some really people, you know, really there's been a lot of chat as well, so I think you'll find it interesting to go in and see awesome. The comments. Yeah, definitely an interesting topic for people. Meanwhile, I'm going to hand back to Valerie, but I know that we're all experiencing lots of storms, talking about resilience, weather-wise, not coastal necessarily, but she disappeared for a minute, but she is back. So.
Yes, so you may wish to, could you please post your answer to the first question again? Because when I lost power, my internet stopped. And so they did not hear your answer.
Oh no, I'm sorry. And that's on the Hoover message board?
The chat for your particular presentation.
Okay, I'll go to there. Yeah.
Thank you.
And also, if you are able to fill out that evaluation and you're interested in learning more, I've got my email on there. vencomio@ufl.edu. And if you want to be reached about any of the future events like the Living Shoreline training course, you can leave me your email and we'll get you on the notification list for that.
Fantastic.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
All right. So go ahead and stop sharing.
Yes.